discussion on Richmond, not Richard, Kelly Turner, and the War in the Pacific. My name is Dr. Christina Giannotta. I'm the Assistant Director for Histories and Archives at NHHC. Our talk today focuses on our most recent publication on Richmond Turner Kelly and World War II planning. For a quick background, Admiral Turner served as the Director of War Plans for the CNO from 1940 to 1941. He was the primary shaper of war plans for the Pacific. In 1942, Admiral Turner took command of the amphibious task force preparing for the Guadalcanal campaign and either led or planned every major amphibious action in the Pacific until 1945. Recognizing the importance of Admiral Turner's work in preparation for World War II, Director of Plans, Policy, and Integration, OPNAV in 5, Rear Admiral Williams, came to the NHHC archives in 2020 to learn a bit more about Admiral Turner's planning process by reviewing his papers held there. After some discussion with the NHHC historians, you see over here, Rear Admiral Williams requested that they work with his team to develop 10 lessons from Turner's experience planning and executing the amphibious campaign in the Pacific. I think the salient point here is that Rear Admiral Williams requested this historical analysis not to teach the history of Turner's experience, but rather to use Turner's experience to create an intellectual space that can invigorate thought and generate new approaches to planning. This publication has been a major success for both NHHC and the Navy. By success here, I mean the effective use of NHHC historians to apply history to support Navy planners and decision makers. Over the past 10 years at least, NHHC has striven to support the Navy this way, but we've struggled to find a successful and sustainable model to meet this goal. Our strength instead is focused on other historical avenues, creating a shared culture and understanding from which we can remember and celebrate those who fought before us. Preserving our past, educating and informing the American public on the need and the use of the U.S. Navy. But is that the only part of the puzzle in which the historians fit? Guardians and preservers of the past? Outside of the National Archives is a sculpture with the inscription "Past is Prologue." Do we as historians just codify remembrance? How can we actively use the past to shape the future? The obvious answer to the historians, that is Navy historians must help shape the future. Navy historians can use history and apply history to provide lessons learned to help decision makers impact Navy today. Yet this perception is riddled with problems and rarely engenders the support of regular action officers or decision makers. And the list of their concerns is long and to a certain extent justified. The war planner, the OPNAV officer, they know their topic. They know their problems, they know their solution sets better than anyone else. They work on their own very short time frame. Is it not then better for them to just read history and apply it to their paradigms? Certainly that would seem the most efficient from their perspective. And this is the issue that's been a major stumbling block for our Navy historians. They aren't of the Navy AO world, and they generally don't have the subject knowledge that an AO would have working in an ENCODE or in their own niche office. So our ability to support Navy using applied history has been stymied to a certain extent. What is very important to keep in mind, however, is that the historians bring something to the table that's very critical to Navy thought process. As Rear Admiral Williams understood, it's something vital about how we face, something vital right now as we face great power competition. And it isn't specifically the history they're teaching, it's scholarly method and conceptualization. The historian thought process provides the AO a different perspective and pushes them to reconsider how they understand and approach their problem set. This improves their intellectual efficiency and effectiveness. The AO alone will have difficulty removing him or herself from their own cultural lens without exposure to this different intellectual approach. Thus, cracking the code to providing Navy this facet of the historian's expertise is critical. The key that we discover here is that the AO and the historian must work together in a joint effort. Neither historian nor AO can do this alone. When a historian understands the specific office or the AO's problem sets, they can use historical examples to help frame how the reader approaches and thinks about the current problem. And an appropriate historical examination of examples gives the consumer more context and a broader awareness from which to question current structures. As Dr. Lupke will examine in his paper on logistics planning in World War II, the lack of sufficient appreciation of logistics severely impacted the execution of war plans. Examining that planning gap isn't about remembering this flaw, but it rather guides planners to consider how they too might be overlooking a critical aspect in their planning, forcing them to rethink their assumptions from new and different angles. Creating intellectual space requires a give and take, both on the side of the AO, to take the time to educate the historian on their problem sets, and on the side of the historian to take the time to understand the need and the direction of the AO, so he or she can construct a useful tool. Clearly, this requires a delicate balance, and achieving that balance through relationship building is what makes it so difficult to consistently produce applied history that supports Navy decision makers and planners. Yet the creation of the space, facilitating a broadened intellectual approach to examine and consider problems, is the edge that our Navy AOs and decision makers need today. Achieving that balance is well worth the effort. And I want to thank In5 for working with us and helping us identify the best way to use applied history to support them. And I also want to thank the historians who had to stretch outside their comfort zone to provide this vital support. So that's my talk. I will now turn to introducing again, Richmond, not Richard. I want to advertise our booklet. You can get it on our NHHC website under publications. We have a digital. But now I would like to introduce our speakers. Our first speaker will be Dr. Tim Francis. Dr. Francis, who is also a Senior Chief Intelligence Specialist in the Navy Reserve, is NHHC's Senior Advisory Historian. He has a PhD in Military History from the University of Maryland, an MA in Russian History from the University of Connecticut, and a BA in History from Howard College. He will be speaking with us today about historians helping Navy planners, a contemporary example. So he's going to go a little bit more in detail about how all this worked for us today. Our next speaker will be Dr. Peter Lupke. He has an MA and PhD from UVA in History. He graduated from William and Mary with degrees in History and East Asian Studies. He is a historian at the NHHC, and editor and co-editor of several of our publications. He will be speaking with us today about learning logistics in World War II, Kelly Turner, and Guadalcanal. Our next speaker will be Dr. Sean Woodford. He received his PhD in War Studies from King's College London, received an MA in Military History from Kansas State University, and a BA in History from the University of Colorado. He will be speaking with us today about Risk and Operation Watchtower. Finally, Lieutenant Commander Lancaster will finish off this session as commentator. Lieutenant Commander Lancaster comes to us from OPNAV M52 branch, and he played a significant role in the development of the Turner booklet. Lieutenant Commander Lancaster has an MA in European and Atlantic History from the University of Tulsa and a BA in International Affairs from the Mary Washington College. He was commissioned through Officer Candidate School with division officer tours in amphibious ships in Japan and Norfolk. So now, without further delay, I'll turn this over to Dr. Francis.
So first I'll apologize for not actually presenting on Turner and civil military relations in 1940 and 41. I was going to do that, but the issue of applied history and our relationship between the civilian historians and OPNAV, I thought needed some more explanation, particularly because in yesterday's session, where Peter Haynes talked about applied history. If anyone who's in that session, it was a great session. I highly recommend either talking to Peter or looking up his paper. I just thought that I could explain our panel as a good news story. So where we actually did what he said, which was isolating things that need talking about in the Navy. Before I start, also just want to mention that there are sometimes ways that historians can kind of get into that AO world in OPNAV. And for example, I'm a Navy reservist, and so I've been mobilized 3 times went to Iraq twice, and in that sort of environment, you develop those AO skills because everything needs to be done yesterday, and it's overtaken by events within 2 days anyway. So the 80% solution there is the solution you're looking for. Now, we didn't do an 80% solution here, of course, but as I'll explain, probably from a historian's perspective, we acted as AOs. So I'm going to actually go through and discuss the process of how we related with Commander Lancaster and N5. So last July, Admiral Williams reached out to us in regards to the papers of Richmond Kelly Turner. He was one of his predecessors, and he encountered Turner through George Dyer's classic, The Amphibians Came to Conquer. There's actually a book written for the Naval NHC, the Naval History Command. And it was designed to capture the lessons of World War II. His initial ask, this is Admiral Williams, was for photos and some papers that he could maybe either hang in his office in OPNAV as a talking point. He was aware of an HHC because of Sam's Director Cox's H-grams, a pamphlet on our website regarding the landings on Tarawa, and so he knew we existed. So he contacted the archives first, I think, and they asked us for assistance. So we, Peter actually, tracked down some lesser known photos of Turner, and we sent Admiral Williams some digital copies and told him about the Turner papers. We also sent him a copy of a booklet we published a few years ago, which was an updated ONI combat narrative of the Battle of Cape St. George. So this is the first point I want to make, which is that through a combination of general and specific outreach, we provided a viable example to Admiral Williams to ponder. That history matters and can help him, our archives, photos, and documents, that the command can provide him this help, and he had the example of the H-grams, and that there was a model of something he could ask for, which was a parallel pamphlet. All three of those components were necessary. So the critical piece there is he had an idea for something, and he saw that we could help. So that's one of those foot-stop points where it's a two-way relationship. We can't just go there and say, hey, we have an idea, right? This is interesting to us. You want it. It had to be iterative. He had to come back to us. I mean, ideally, he has to have the idea in the first place. So a piece of that is that we have to have the information and documents and photos that he needs in the first place. So that's why having the papers was of value. The fact that we had the Turner papers, we only had because Dyer wrote his book and then gave them to us. We had the photo collections because we've collected them over the decades. So that's a shout out to the archives, and I know we have some archivists here, that without your ability to hold that material, we couldn't have done any of this. So there's a role, that's the historian-archive relationship. Now, the process could have ended there, right? We provide a lot of RFI answers to a lot of different people, and this could have just been one of many. But an interesting thing happened. A completely separate RFI came in also in August, and it was about Admiral Cox wanted an info paper showing how the Guadalcanal campaign illustrated some of the themes in the Marine Corps Commandant's 2019 planning guidance. So, we ginned that up in a couple of days, but that got us thinking about Guadalcanal, a little bit about Turner. So then, literally a few days later, Admiral Williams came and visited the archives. He was looking at photos. Peter met with him, and it was a pretty critical meeting because N5 was already thinking about, they wanted to develop something themselves as a teaching tool for their own planning staff. So they would sort of get some ideas on how to think about these problems. And of course, those problems were things along the lines of what is the Navy facing today in regards to basing in the Pacific, expeditionary forces, and sustainment, which are similar questions today as to the 1942. So what's the saying? History doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. Admiral Williams, he wanted creativity and sustained engagement with written communication from his planners. And he understood that historical study provides one of the best ways to foster that imagination and develop those skills. A couple days after that meeting, in August, we floated a proposal to build out this handbook idea. And since Turner was the main logistics planner for Guadalcanal, we thought a reconsideration of Valentine's naval logistics of World War II or Dyer's David's Came to Conquer might be in order. Both those books, Peter will talk about, because they were generated out of post-World War II lessons learned concepts. So here's the second point I wanted to make here, which is that we had to seize the opportunity to make this work. We knew N5 was focused on current planning efforts in the Pacific, and while we aren't in the room with them, it isn't rocket scientists or science to see how these lessons would have applicability today. Indeed, the term contested logistics environment is a buzzword lately, but that's been around for a decade. It's also in that 2019 Marine Corps planning guidance document. But even still, we almost lost the plot. For a bunch of reasons, the new fiscal year, other projects, we let things slide, and we didn't really re-engage with the N5 staff until November of last year. And so to get to the point that Dr. Giannata made about the AO and the speed of an AO. So when we went back to N5 in November and early December, we kind of hashed out a way ahead, and Admiral Williams was basically like, we need this pretty fast, right? And we kind of understood that because of, there's tours of 2 or 3 years. So if you're going to get something out of your staff planners, they need to get up to speed very fast. So we had to change our mindset that it had to be done on N5's timetable and not our, thoughtful, long-term historian time frame. So in a flurry of meetings, we hashed out a proposal. We'd write 10 chapters. 3 historians would do it. I wrote 2, Peter wrote 3, Sean wrote 5, because he was able to commit more of his full time to it. And we do it in 8 weeks. And Peter and I both had still other jobs to do at work. So it was a busy couple of months, but, and we decided we write it sort of as if we were AOs, right? Quick, clear, well-written analysis. I know that's ideal it doesn't always happen with AOs, but that was the goal. And interestingly, upon reflection, we thought of, this is a lot like the officers who wrote the combat narratives during World War II, some of those post-battle reports. They had to do it fast and get it back out to the fleet. So we were, a pale imitation model of that attempt. So the other piece I want to say is that we'd write it in 8 weeks, and then we're going to get 4 weeks of editing, and then get a print-ready PDF available. We weren't going to get it printed, actually a hard copy that fast. This actually didn't get printed until last month, or actually earlier this month, right?
Last week.
Last week. All right, there we go. So the third point I want to make about this is this is why it's a good news story, right? We managed to get it done in 8 weeks. We had some back and forth. This is actually version 2. We have some edits later in the year. And that's kind of why it was delayed till now. But the combination of the historians working with N5, sort of a force multiplier. We'd never written anything this fast, but we're all practicing historians. A lot of deep historical expertise, and we could produce a careful, thoughtful, analytical booklet at speed. And the speed, of course, was necessary, as I mentioned before, because he needed it quickly. In that sense, the historians are an in-house pool of intellectual capital for the Navy that is provided essentially at no cost to the people who want to use us. Not like an office or N5, if they wanted a contractor to do it, they'd have to find the money somewhere, pay for a contractor. But we're already being paid by the Navy. And if you simmer those skills over years and even decades, well-trained historians with a deep amount of expertise, they can produce, sift through massive information and produce works that are thoughtful, analytical, and can summarize the big picture for the Navy. It's kind of like an intelligence analyst I did a few times on deployment, where you analyze these streams of information together and you produce something that is greater than the sum of its parts. So, and that's the great thing about the History Command, is we have all those records and all that deep experience in the staff who can do that. So I don't want to overstate this to kind of sum things up. I don't want to overstate it, but like Herbert Richmond and John Sumida's arguments, there's a value in historians trying to look at things with imagination based on deep subject matter expertise, to view things with a long-developed mind's eye. To sort of play off what Dr. Giannotta said about historians work for the Navy within the Navy, but they don't always think like the Navy, which means that we can provide that external perspective to help today's AOs see a bit beyond current demands and processes. That's the reason why Mahan and Clausewitz were more concerned with analysis than examples. They wanted to teach people how to think. So I like to think that Admiral Williams, being a history major, had a grasp of this nature and saw the value of historical analysis as it relates to the professional naval officer today. And it's provided that relationship. We've done more than just produce this booklet. We actually did a discussion on the Simek Podcast, which is, I think it was released on September 15th. And on a lot of these, we discussed a lot of the issues that we're going to talk about today. But the sort of thing I want to end with is that, one, Admiral Williams got something useful from us at no cost to him, no cost to his office. And that I think that's a good reason why DNS and CNO pay for us historians to work at History. So with that, I'll turn it over to Peter.
All right, I'll go ahead and get started while the slideshow is going. I'm going to stand so that my big head doesn't rob the pictures that are coming to their full effect. But I'm going to start out by quoting a lieutenant commander who gave a Naval War College lecture on logistics in 1951. He started out by saying, all I can do here is give you a sort of kickoff to give you some ideas which you can think about. And that's where this talk came from, really, are some ideas from Kelly Turner's experiences in World War II. And so I'm not really going to talk much about Kelly Turner at all today. I'm going to talk about the Navy's discovery or rediscovery, or whatever you want to call it, of logistics as a field or concept during World War II. So I'm not going to talk about the nuts or the bolts of logistics, more almost in a way an intellectual history of thinking about logistics in the Navy. And that was kind of shocking because today it's common sense that logistics have to be attended to and they're a vital part of the planning process. But on investigation, it really wasn't that way during World War II, or at least the start of World War II. So that's going to be my overall focus today. Really, why didn't the Navy think much about logistics before World War II? What steps did it take to learn it during the war? And how does that really shift our historical understanding a little bit? So all of these little Navy stickmen are from the first theater logistics manual that the Navy produced. And so right here, just a little overview of basic logistics. You see from left to right, requirements, procurement, and distribution. Today, I'm really going to be talking more about the ideas of procurement and distribution. And so Duncan Valentine, who was mentioned earlier, he was a naval reservist during World War II who was tasked with writing an administrative history of naval logistics. And so he's probably the foremost authority on the subject because he talked to the actors, had access to the records. And he wrote about the Navy's aims of timing, motion, and selection, which were essential to an orderly flow of support, and it could only be achieved through an integrated operation. And he pointed out that the Navy hadn't gone to war with such an integrated operation. And so that's one of the points I'm making here, is that World War II was where the Navy began to integrate plans, logistics, and operations. And so the kind of tangential relationship to Kelly Turner here is that in Amphibians Came to Conquer, which was already mentioned with George C. Dyer, Dyer says in it that the Navy learned the importance of logistics during World War II, which sort of seemed flabbergasting when I came across it. What do you mean the Navy didn't learn logistics? That's how it won World War II. And so I did a little bit of digging, and I was kind of shocked to find that on the whole, Dyer was kind of right about that. And that the World War II was the process by which the Navy learned logistics, and it didn't come to that conflict with it. And so right here we have the commander showing us the importance of fleet support for naval task forces. And so before World War II, that fleet support wasn't something the Navy had to do. And once again, I thought this was fairly amazing to consider and contemplate that. And then I went ahead and pulled out an authority on the Navy's forward operations over history, Peter Schwartz's Forward from the Start. And in case you think I'm just playing to the audience, it's written on the paper right here. But the Navy's always engaged in forward operations, but for the most part, these forward operations involved only single ships. And then as Peter Schwartz also noted, is that even when squadrons came about in the mid-19th century and started to operate, they were mostly administrative formations with evolutions being single ship. And then, of course, during the Civil War, there was a vast expansion of the Union fleet. But for the most part, the operations were coastal around the United States or in the waterways where supplies were easy at hand and could be obtained in an ad hoc fashion as necessary. And so the start of the Navy really thinking about logistics came with the Great White Fleet at the start of the 20th century. And so there's almost an embarrassing moment in the Great White Fleet's voyage when in the nether regions of the South Pacific around Australia, they were short on coal and had to scramble to contract foreign vessels to bring supplies of coal there. And at that, the Navy kind of scratched its head a little bit and said, if we're fighting a war, it may be a problem that we don't have coaling stations or ways to get fuel to our ships. And also worth noting is that the Great White Fleet did not involve wartime expenditures of munitions, countermeasures, ammunition, everything else that's involved for what a Navy does. And then World War I, as some people are in the room are more aware of than others, is that the Navy did deploy forward in a large scale, but it drew largely upon British stockpiles, practices, and infrastructure, and British bases and support at Queenstown and Scapa Flow. The U.S. fleet also never saw action as a unified force or had to be supplied by the United States as such. And so World War I suggested the need for a more developed logistics planning apparatus, but it hadn't really strained the Navy. One authority commented that in final analysis, World War I was, quote, a fairly simple one theater, one pipeline business. And so the way that the Navy sort of handled all of these issues, at least before World War II, this tripartite board really, well, not board, excuse me, tripartite system of different organizations. There's the General Board, which is the Naval Staff, which John Kuhn has written the book about. And that had been created after the Spanish-American War to fill a general kind of planning capacity. And then after much lobbying, the Chief of Naval Operations appeared in 1916 to handle more of the day-to-day administration of the Navy. And then as an adjunct planning apparatus to all of this, you had the Naval War College, which functioned between World War I and World War II in a lot of ways as a staff adjunct. And as Norman Friedman has pointed out with his book, Winning a Future War, is that the Naval War College wargaming served as a way for the Navy to test tactical ideas and operational ideas through its wargaming. And then all of this is complicated by the fact that the people who are doing the actual procurement and supply of materials within the United States are the Bureau system still. And the Bureau system reports directly to the Secretary of the Navy, not the Chief of Naval Operations, who is responsible for most of the planning at this time. And so in the interwar period, after the drawdown of the Navy and retrenchment following World War I, there's really a shift away from kind of codifying any of those logistics actions. One officer said of the interwar period, there's a tendency to think of the fleet as always ready and to forget that routine provision of fuel, ammunition, and standard supplies did not comprise the whole problem of logistics. And so even though the fleet deployed forward in California and later Hawaii and engaged in the fleet exercises, as near as I can tell, what really ended up happening is that these fleet exercises, the Naval War College war games, were much more of a tactical operational nature. And as mentioned, they just sort of assumed that the necessary supplies would be there writ large. And the study of logistics didn't get any special traction at the Naval War College either. A logistics section had been set up by Captain R.R. Backenhuis in 1926, but only stayed around as long as his tenure. His replacement came in and immediately proclaimed that matters such as shoveling coal and combat loading didn't belong with the study of the principles of war. And that was the end of that. And it wasn't until after World War II that the Naval War College reestablished the Department of Logistics. And so the famous War Plan Orange, the Rainbow Plans that the Navy had before World War II, which more or less conceptualized the drive across the Pacific, validated through the war games, the fleet exercises, is that they made really brilliant plans for operations, but they didn't talk about logistics that much. Admiral James O. Richardson noted that Orange included assumptions about readiness that couldn't really be dealt with until the fighting actually broke out. Is basically right. The point of plans is that it's not actual until it is actual. But out of all of this with the War College, the planning process, fleet problems, is that the Navy began to think about things that would be essential for World War II, even if it didn't institutionalize them or establish them within the organization. And examples of these include fueling at sea, which was vitally important, And then the package base units that would become known as the Cub Lion, Acorn Oak. And then later on, that would morph into a general catalog system. And then to stress again is that the outbreak of World War II did find the Navy in a difficult logistic position, as the suppliers, as the bureaus, had a separate chain of command than the operating forces. The bureaus were responsible for the procurement and the production of the material, and added into this were the naval districts, which were the regional agents of the Navy Department. And so at the start of the war, the bureaus, districts, and OpNav, i.e. the fleet, were poorly integrated, which all led to confusion, duplication of effort, and chaotic tracking of materials. Bottlenecks were common, particularly on the West Coast, kind of zone of friction between the naval district, the bureaus, and then the operating forces in the Pacific. And so vast quantities of supplies destined for the Pacific would pile up in San Francisco with no notice to anyone, which also created large problems with allocating shipping. And so these problems with really administrative organization, while apparent very early on in the war, would take time to address. And so some of the solution was provided with the dual hatting of Ernie King as CNO and Cominch, and also additional authorities that President Roosevelt got with the emergency in the run-up to World War II and World War II, which allowed him to get around some of the restrictions about communication between the operating forces and the bureaus. And now Kelly Turner will hop into the story once again, because when the United States entered World War II, stockpiles had already been accumulated at various points, and the logistics pump had been primed. U.S. aid to Britain through Lend-Lease meant that lots of equipment and material had been collected in central locations and ready for shipping, either for the British themselves or to build U.S. bases overseas in places such as Iceland. And so the initial amphibious operations in the Pacific, read here Kelly Turner's Guadalcanal campaign, could draw upon the goods already produced and ready for distribution. The first U.S. Navy advanced base in the Pacific, which was Bobcat at Bora Bora, really owed its existence to Lend-Lease. One study done at the time, more or less, noted that it could never have been carried out in so short a time if not for the Lend-Lease projects that preceded it. Most of the equipment and much of the construction material was drawn from the stocks that had accumulated at Quonset Point in Rhode Island. And so the experiences of Kelly Turner show how logistics functioned in a practical way in the early campaigns of World War II. As Dyer's account of Kelly Turner and logistics shows, Turner used brute force and ad hoc planning to make everything work in lieu of centralized logistics planning. And so one observation I've made here, which is not, of course, novel to me, is that during World War II, the Navy didn't really have much of a problem with the production side of logistics, really with the distribution side of logistics. And the Lend-Lease and aid to Britain really kind of smoothed over that initial bump in production until the United States economy could come up to speed. And so, George Dyer made the observation, and Amphibians came to conquer based on his talks with Turner, that the campaign had gone ahead essentially with logistics support hurrying behind and not already in place. And Turner, for his part, said about Guadalcanal, in no part of naval combat operations did logistics require a larger part of a commander's attention than in our early amphibious operations, and thought that he spent about 80% of his time rushing from one logistics crisis to another. And these were distribution problems, mainly, and also where Turner got his famous knowledge. His one oral history claimed that Turner knew down to the cubic foot how much marine equipment would take up in shipping holds. And so he knew everything and had to rush around making everything work. Is not what a commander should be doing, ideally, especially in the middle of combat operations. And certainly you can see some stresses in the U.S. Navy surrounding Guadalcanal. So Many of the people who studied the Navy's logistics during World War II at the time more or less concurred with what Turner had to say, as well as Dyer's conclusions that production could compensate for the distribution bottlenecks. Duncan Valentine, among others, pointed out that the transportation component in the Pacific was handled not always well by the Western Sea frontier. And what ended up happening was a iron mountain of supplies were produced and more or less dumped across the Pacific, and then people could take what they needed from them. And so that's how they addressed the problem of distributing materials. Senior Navy leadership also grasped this point. The post-war president of the Naval War College, Vice Admiral Donald B. Beery, opined that World War II constituted the greatest outpouring of national wealth and substance the world had ever seen. But he acknowledged we made mistakes, literally thousands of costly mistakes. And yet, in spite of our mistakes, we were still able to smother our enemies with the sheer preponderance of the material of war. And the Navy began the process of correcting logistics shortcomings during the war itself, grasping that the primary issue was one of administration. Industry could produce the material, the nation more or less had the capacity to transport that material to where it needed to go, but what the Navy was really lacking was ensuring that the right material got to the right place at the right time. And this observation holds broadly true whether it's expeditionary logistics in the Pacific or the logistics of securing necessary materials and components for ship construction in the United States. It really embraces all of that. And as early as 1940, before the US gets involved in the shooting part of World War II on its own, Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox had entered discussions with the consulting firm of Booz, Allen, and Hamilton to help him with the administrative and management problems of the Navy. And this initial survey resulted in a report by business administration experts who recommended changes to the secretariats and some of the Navy's bureaus. The success of the evaluation within the Secretariat prompted the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations to in turn hire Booz, Allen, and Hamilton to do the same sort of thing for them, asking for a special emphasis on the problem of the coordination of the Navy's logistics efforts in support of combat operations. And the preliminary reports arrived on 5th November and 24 December 1942, so that the Navy could get to work on implementing the recommendations even before the final report, which arrived in March 1943. And so the Booz, Allen, Hamilton survey made observations that today seem like common sense, but apparently weren't at the time. For example, one point made was that logistics situations and possibilities had not been fully or properly represented to the planning section. Another point was there has been no real integration and coordination of logistics plans with strategic plans. And this is the coordination happening right there. The co-located desks that government workers of all kinds recognize today. And so it went. And so the overall upshot of the report was the recommendation that the planning division and the Chief of Naval Operations be changed to include a logistics plans division, and that it be given elevated status, including the billet of Rear Admiral to head it. The purpose of the logistics plans division would be to work not only with the strategic plans, but also get information from the bureaus and coordinate that with the Chief of Naval Operations. And wartime exigency accounted almost entirely for this reorganization, as the Navy drew its authority from the reshuffle from an executive order. And thus, the newly minted Logistics Plans Division came into existence on 21st December 1942, under the leadership of Rear Admiral Oscar C. Badger. And you just point out again, that is 21st December 1942 that you have a flag-headed Logistics Plans Division, not NAV. And so not surprisingly, problems continued, and a successive series of administrative studies in 1944, the Secretary of the Navy asked T.P. Archer, who was Vice President of General Motors Corporation, and George W. Wolfe, who was President of the United States Steel Export Company, to examine production issues, as well as other logistics issues. As with the earlier Booz, Allen, Hamilton report, the General Motors and United States Steel report provided basic recommendations related to broad policy rather than the nuts and bolts of detail. So some of the recommendations included strategic plans and logistics availability need to be kept in constant reconciliation and balance. They also remarked that action should be taken to establish proper forecasting and scheduling procedures for logistics requirements. Also, documentation should be kept up to date. And also that the Navy should contemplate the establishment of a mechanism for making available to the upper levels of management sufficient facts and figures on performance to enable management to evaluate results properly and to apply correctives. So that is all saying is that there is a deficient management control system and mechanisms as late as 44 even. And so this is all a body of knowledge that the Navy is building up during World War II, which are the suggestions made in these reports to the Secretary of the Navy on naval logistics, the findings of Duncan Valentine, the lessons of hard knocks. And of course, this process makes sense once you think about it, or at least it did to me, is that the exigencies of war prevented a rational restructuring to take place during the fighting itself. And the Navy was facing an unprecedented situation with World War II. And so the Navy took what steps it could, studies on administrative efficiency. And then President Roosevelt and the executive also get involved. In 1943, Roosevelt ordered the Bureau of the Budget to oversee a study of the administration of the war by federal agencies, and Robert G. Albion was put in charge of the Navy's portion. And so Albion's team produced numerous papers on the history of the Navy administration during World War II, included Duncan Valentine's U.S. Naval Logistics in the Second World War, and Robert H. Connery's The Navy and Industrial Mobilization in World War II. Also, any of you who have used the administrative histories of the Chief of Naval Operations during World War II, is that all stemmed from this same administrative study, which was entirely co-located but administratively separate from the Navy's capturing of history during World War II, which was mostly under the auspices of the Office of Naval Intelligence. So after World War II, the Navy reestablished the Department of Logistics at the Naval War College under then Captain Henry Eccles, who served as the first head. Eccles himself pointed out the lack of pre-war thinking on logistics problems. He loved the book from 1917, Pure Logistics, The Science of War Preparation by Marine Lieutenant Colonel Cyrus Stork, which had gone unnoticed until Eccles found it after the war. He remarked in a lecture, initial attempt to develop theory and principle attracted little or no attention until 5 copies were found in the Naval War College Library in 1945. And I did check WorldCat, and it does seem like those were probably the only library copies in existence at the time. All WorldCat shows now are the National Defense University republications of it, as well as the Naval War College's republication of it. And the Naval War College and the thinkers there did take notice overall. The first years of Naval War College Review, which interestingly in its first years was a controlled publication, as it was dominated by articles on logistics and logistics planning. Admiral Robert B. Carney, Halsey's chief of staff during World War II, and then the DCNO for logistics, remarked, as the first class in logistics was getting underway, I expressed the great satisfaction I felt on that occasion. He felt relief that so many obstacles had been overcome in launching the logistics course and confidence in the ensured preservation of the Navy's hard-earned logistical know-how. Carney's lecture on logistics appeared in the very first issue of the Naval War College Review in 1948. Subsequent issues included a number of other lectures which demonstrated a revitalized focus on the subject. A sampling of the most directly relevant pieces include basic elements of naval logistics, problems of command in logistics, theater logistics planning, major logistics lessons of World War II, and finally, simply logistics. Writers included Oscar Badger, again, the Rear Admiral who stood up OP-12, as well as other officers at the 06 rank. And these articles all suggested that the lessons of World War II were still being digested. One lecturer opined it is essential we collect and tabulate good usage data that incorporates the operating experience under which it is accumulated. A sentiment which, of course, echoes the 1944 recommendations on the importance of documentation and managers' controls. so I thought this would be a nice slide. Is organizing the organization was one of the major outcomes of all of these studies in World War II and after. So you can see charting provides a graph of an organization's efficiency. So we have the 4 lieutenant drafting the org chart, obviously multiple times because the principal doesn't like what's happening with it. And so this also represents what began to happen with the formal codification of lessons in Navy publications. Captain M.M. Dupre prepared, and in 1949 was issued NAVPERS 10861, which focused on the production side of logistics and the economy and national security. And then on the more practical side of matters came Henry Eccles' NAVPERS 10869 in 1949, which handled theater logistics. And on the heels of those books came George Carroll Dyer's Manual for the Naval Institute Press, which had gone through 2 editions by 1962. And so that brings me to the conclusion of the talk. And so what lessons does this hold for today? I think always a good reminder is that peacetime processes are designed for peacetime, and they may not always work in wartime. I think a recurrent theme, not really that developed in my talk, but the administrative divides, those gaps and friction between the producers and the suppliers, the gaps that arise between authorities, and really the cognizance between districts and theaters. Those still happen today in various forms. And also that there was a confusion in the earlier stages of the war, and that the Navy muddled along in a way, but very well. And it wasn't until after the war that it really began to put into place the administrative and organizational structures to fight World War II again. And so I think this serves in some ways as a cautionary tale, but also I think it gives some hope in that thinking about these problems and essentially that plans are plans and will have to change once the shooting starts, and that peacetime logistics pipelines may not be efficient or set up for wartime support and supply is something that's worth thinking about today. Thank you.
Unless anybody objects, I'd like to take my mask off because I think they'll have a better chance of understanding me. Good morning. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to be talking about risk and Operation Watchtower, which is a topic that came out of writing our pamphlet that I found intriguing. So, Operation Watchtower, the first Allied counteroffensive in the Pacific Theater during World War II, nearly ended in abrupt defeat as a result of the Battle of Sable Island on the night of 8 August 1942. Only by luck did Rear Admiral Turner's South Pacific Amphibious Force evade destruction at the hands of a Japanese naval force led by Vice Admiral Mikawa Gunichi. Now, the ultimate success of the Guadalcanal campaign has obscured the level of risk entailed in undertaking this initial landing operation. U.S. military doctrine defines risk as the probability and consequence of an event causing harm to something valued. How aware were American political and military leaders of the possibility and cost of failure? How did they think about these prospects? What steps were taken to mitigate the dangers? And who bore responsibility for risk-taking? Now, I use the contemporary U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff Joint Risk Analysis methodology to examine how the prospects for Watchtower were considered and addressed. I contend that Admiral Ernest J. King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet, took the risk in mounting the operation and therefore bore primary responsibility for the near disaster at Sable Island. He overruled the recommended mitigation of the 2 theater commanders, General Douglas MacArthur and Vice Admiral Robert Gormley. His insistence on an aggressive timeline for executing Watchtower foreclosed opportunities to reduce the risk to Turner's force, which constituted the center of gravity for the operation. Assessing risk has always been a function of leadership in warfare, but the practice of analyzing it explicitly is a recent phenomenon. U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff use a methodology that breaks the process into three components: risk appraisal, generation of knowledge and understanding; risk management, decisions and actions to manage or mitigate risk; and risk communication, the exchange of risk perspectives across processes and among leadership. The risk assessment and appraisal process has 4 steps. 1, problem framing, risk to what; 2, risk assessment, risk from what; 3, risk judgment, how much risk is okay; and 4, risk management, what should be done about this risk. I will use this heuristic to analyze the assessment of risk entailed with Watchtower. So, I'm going to talk about the origins of Watchtower. Watchtower had its roots in pre-war U.S. Navy Orange war plans against Japan and King's wartime concept for strategy in the Pacific theater. Appointed by Roosevelt as commander-in-chief of the fleet after the Pearl Harbor attack, King embodied the Navy's offensive mindset and possessed a detailed understanding of Orange planning. In line with the general Orange concept, King embedded his intent to shift to a counteroffensive as soon as possible into U.S. strategic planning from the outset. The U.S.-British Arcadia Conference in December 1941, January 42 affirmed the pre-war commitment to prioritizing the war against Germany and that minimum forces would be used in the Pacific. At King's behest, the U.S. and British combined chiefs of staff agreed that points of vantage from which an offensive against Japan can eventually be developed must be secured. Now, the points that King had in mind were the string of South Pacific islands that lay along the sea line of communications between the U.S. West Coast, Hawaii, and Australia, which the U.S. Army and Navy agreed to garrison. His initial instructions to Admiral Chester Nimitz, the new Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, were to hold Hawaii and Midway, and only in a smaller degree less important, maintain communications between the U.S. and Australia. King's focus on the South Pacific sharpened when the Japanese captured Rabaul, Kavang, and the Northern Solomon Islands in late January 1942. He accepted the additional responsibility for defending the northern and northeastern sea approaches to Australia. He requested that the Joint Chiefs of Staff establish further South Pacific bases to form a system of groups of islands whose air contingents will provide mutual support and which would offer security for the operations of our naval forces and sea communications. Now, in response to questions from the Army Chief of Staff, General George Marshall, King spelled out his plan in detail. The scheme or concept of operations is not only to protect the line of communications from Australia, but in doing so, set up strong points from which step-by-step general advance can be made through the New Hebrides, Solomons, and Bismarck archipelago. He planned to use Marines to capture positions and Army forces to hold them. President Theodore Roosevelt approved King's concept at a combined Chiefs of Staff meeting on 5 March 1942, stating that it is an established fact that activity in the Pacific would follow the Navy's general scheme. However, less than 2 weeks later, the Joint Chiefs unanimously reaffirmed the commitment to building up forces in Europe and limiting reinforcements for the Pacific. Nonetheless, King instructed Rear Admiral Turner, who was his chief planner at the time, to write a new campaign plan for the Pacific theater based on this concept, which was completed in April. Now, the Joint Chiefs of Staff divided the Pacific theater into a Pacific Ocean area under Nimitz and a Southwest Pacific area under MacArthur. Thank you. Turner advised King that taking bases in the Solomons and Santa Cruz Islands would require amphibious assaults supported by enough naval and air strength to ensure continuous local superiority. He recommended assigning a naval commander to carry out the campaign of operations. King instructed Nimitz to establish a South Pacific Area Command and to prepare for execution of major amphibious offensives. Nimitz selected Vice Admiral Gormley to command SOPAC. At that time, King told Gormley that I do not have the tools to give you to carry out the task as it should be, but in time, possibly this fall, we hope to start an offensive in the South Pacific. Now, in response to the Japanese capture of Tulagi early in May, Nimitz proposed in late May a raid using a Marine Raider battalion. King concurred, but MacArthur, in whose command Tulagi lay, thought that the Japanese garrison to be too large to warrant the effort. He told King and Nimitz that he planned to undertake offensive action at the earliest possible date and suggested to push through the island southeast of the Solomons to start. Now, the Navy's victory at the Battle of Midway in early June changed the strategic situation. The day after the Battle of Midway ended, MacArthur proposed an operation to Marshall to take Rabaul using his ground forces and air forces, supported by a Marine division and 2 Navy carriers. On 12 June, Marshall asked King for a meeting to discuss the plan. King kept Marshall waiting for almost 2 weeks while attempting to enlist British participation in a simultaneous operation against Timor in the East Indies, which the British declined to do. Meanwhile, on 21 June, the combined chiefs of staff met at the White House and gave their general approval that in the Pacific Theater, gnawing or step-by-step amphibious operations should be launched as soon as possible, probably about the 1st of August, to attempt to take advantage of the victory at Midway. Though the joint planners were favorable to MacArthur's plan, King opposed it because it would expose carriers to land-based air attack in confined waters and because MacArthur would lead it. On 25 June, King suggested to Marshall a joint campaign to capture the Solomons, New Guinea, and Rabaul under Gormley's command. Marshall balked, but when King threatened to undertake an operation against Tulagi with Navy resources alone, he relented. Marshall accepted King's suggestion of a 3-phase campaign, with Gormley leading the seizure of Tulagi and Santa Cruz, Task 1, while MacArthur directed the capture of the remainder of the Solomons, Task 2, and then the conquest of New Guinea and Rabaul, Task 3. King issued orders on behalf of the Joint Chiefs on 2 July, designating the Tulagi-Santa Cruz operation Watchtower with a start date of 1 August. Nimitz assigned Gormley strategic command in person, appointed Turner to lead the SOPAC amphibious force, and named Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher to command the supporting aircraft carrier task forces. After intelligence revealed that the Japanese were preparing an airfield on the nearby Guadalcanal Island, King and Nimitz prioritized landings there, with the Santa Cruz occupation to follow. Now the assessment of risk. There appears to have been little consideration of Watchtower's overall prospects. A general consensus existed among Roosevelt and the Joint Chiefs that it would succeed. There's no record that King sought presidential approval to execute the operation, though Roosevelt was aware of the effort. Discussion of the operation at the strategic level apparently ended once King and Marshall reached agreement on the command arrangements. The Joint Planning Staff did not review Watchtower's feasibility or assess its potential impact. King and Marshall left for consultation in London on 15 July as a result of British Prime Minister Winston Churchill calling off a cross-channel invasion in favor of landings in North Africa. By the time King and Marshall returned to Washington 10 days later, the Watchtower forces were already at sea. The task of appraising Watchtower's risks fell to King and to the theater and tactical commanders. They framed the problem in 3 ways: strategic risk, risk to mission, and risk to forces. King defined the strategic risk. He believed the threat of a Japanese attack on the South Pacific line of communications, even after Midway, justified the hazards of launching his long-planned counteroffensive unilaterally by the Navy if need be. The discovery of the Guadalcanal airfield only added urgency to this. King intended for Watchtower to preempt the Japanese from completing it, which he asserted would hamper, if not prevent, the establishment of crucial air bases in the New Hebrides and Santa Cruz Islands. Unlike King, MacArthur and Gormley perceived the threat of Japanese air power as a risk to the mission. On 8 July, they advised that due to inadequate Allied land-based air power, Watchtower would be attended with the gravest risk. The scarcity of protective air support meant that the invasion forces would be exposed to continued hostile air, surface, and submarine attack, and that Fletcher's carriers would likely be too busy defending themselves to provide sufficient fighter cover for the landings. The improbability of surprise, the unfavorable air power balance, and a lack of shipping for reinforcement and resupply led them to conclude that the successful accomplishment of the operation is open to the gravest doubts. Now, Turner and Fletcher, the tactical commanders, were acutely aware of the vulnerabilities of their forces. The amphibious ships were critical to Watchtower's success, while the carriers constituted the primary U.S. naval combat power in the Pacific. The Navy could ill afford losses to either. Turner had been allocated 14 of the Pacific Fleet's 16 attack transports, specifically modified to operate landing craft lighters essential for over-the-shore landing operations. The Navy had only 41 total attack transports in commission in August 1942. The rest were assigned to the Atlantic Fleet. There were no port facilities at Guadalcanal or Tulagi. All personnel and cargo had to be carried to the beaches, so unmodified ships would be of little use in reinforcing or supplying the landing forces. Excuse me. After the loss of 2 carriers at Coral Sea and Midway, only 5 remained in the Navy. Nimitz's Pacific Fleet had 4 of them, and he assigned 3 to Fletcher. The first of the new carriers under construction was not expected to join the fleet until mid-1943. Now, aware of their exposure, the same leaders also had a good beat on the threats they faced. King viewed the most important of these as the potential expansion of Japanese land-based aircraft at Guadalcanal and anything that might delay the execution of Watchtower. In contrast to King's singular focus, Nimitz and the Simek staff warned of the likelihood that the operation would initiate an attritional struggle. On 6 July, Simek staff estimate of the situation stated that whatever the method, when we are committed to the offensive and all that the offensive implies, we must expect and be able to afford disproportionate losses in gaining our objective. We are not prepared to lose ships and men yet. The time is not yet right. King observed in a letter to King on 17 July that the Japanese possessed the means and will to try to retake Guadalcanal, which portended close fighting contact, resulting in U.S. losses in personnel, planes, and ships. Without a steady flow of replacements, the campaign could not advance to the next tasks, and we may be unable even to hold what we have taken. Now, Allied intelligence had a remarkably good picture of the Japanese order of battle. The Simek staff estimate noted that the high quality of both Japanese troops and pilots while lamenting the superiority of their fighter aircraft. The network of Japanese air bases afforded good coverage of the prospective battle area. Inferior aircraft, fewer numbers, and a lack of bases made it a challenge to neutralize the Japanese advantages. Now, while gauging the air threat reasonably well, Watchtower's architects underestimated the threat that nearly defeated them, the Imperial Navy's night fighting capability. Mindful of the Japanese cruiser destroyer force based at Rabaul, King and Nimitz provided Turner with a screen of 6 heavy and 2 light cruisers and 15 destroyers, which Turner placed under the command of Royal Navy Rear Admiral Victor A.C. Crutchland. While powerful on paper, the mixed U.S.-Australian force had no opportunity to exercise together, lacked surface combat experience, and operated with flawed battle doctrine. The Navy ships possessed radar, but commanders and operators were unfamiliar with its limitations at this stage of the war. Technology would not offset superior Japanese night combat training, experience, and doctrine. In contrast to the assessment, the judgment and management of risk proved far less effective. King's insistence on an aggressive timeline for executing Watchtower foreclosed opportunities to mitigate the risk to the invasion forces. MacArthur and Gormley recommended on 8 July deferring Watchtower pending the further development of forces and the development of bases for their support to permit the execution of all 3 tasks in one continuous movement. Responding 2 days later, King stated that the JCS fully appreciate the disadvantage. Nevertheless, they do not desire to countermand operations already underway. The tight schedule prevented the widely separated Watchtower commanders from coordinating except by radio. Critical issues could not be thoroughly discussed and resolved. Gormley issued his operations order for Watchtower on 16 July, naming Fletcher as the Joint Task Force commander, but offering no guidance as to how much risk should be taken to protect the landing forces. Before the Battle of Midway in mid-May, King had instructed Nimitz to avoid involving his forces in a decisive battle likely to incur heavy losses in our carriers and cruisers. Nimitz in turn directed Fletcher to operate on the principle of calculated risk, meaning that he was to avoid exposure of your force to attack by superior enemy forces without good prospect of inflicting, as a result of such exposure, greater damage to the enemy. Neither King nor Nimitz updated their guidance to Gormley or Fletcher for assessing the relative risk to the carriers versus protecting the amphibious force. When Gormley took command of SOPAC, Nimitz told him that SINGPAC would place task forces under his command, but that Gormley would not interfere with the missions unless circumstances indicated that specific measures were required. This oddly proscriptive guidance undoubtedly confused Gormley's understanding of his command prerogatives. He left the burden of determining risk to Fletcher, who reverted to Nimitz's standing orders. Now, the issue came to the fore at the only watchtower planning conference aboard Fletcher's flagship Saratoga on 27 July in Coral Bay, Fiji, during the landing rehearsals. Incredibly, Gormley declined to attend and sent his chief of staff, Rear Admiral Daniel J. Callahan, instead. Now, having been at sea since 7 July with little opportunity to exercise his role as the Joint Task Force commander, Fletcher fruitlessly questioned Callahan about incomplete planning, the inability of the expeditionary force to train together, and inadequate logistics. Turner requested that Fletcher's carriers provide air support for 3 to 6 days. He tentatively planned for the transports to depart by the evening of the second day, leaving only the cargo ships to finish unloading supplies. Concerned about Japanese land-based and naval air attacks and the availability of fuel, Fletcher committed to remain in support for only 72 hours. Without Gormley present to adjudicate the issue, Fletcher's view prevailed that the risk to his carriers outweighed extending air coverage for debarking the remainder of the landing force's supplies. Turner's amphibious force landed the 1st Marine Division on Tulagi and Guadalcanal on 7 August 1942. The Marines quickly overwhelmed the defenders, but stubborn resistance on Tulagi forced Turner to commit his reserve forces. This prevented the transports from departing as scheduled, but Turner did not report this to Fletcher. Fletcher's fighter cover effectively protected Turner's force from the Japanese air attacks on 7 and 8 August, which sank 1 transport and damaged 2 destroyers. Just before sunset on 8 August, citing significant fighter losses, the presence of Japanese carrier-type aircraft, and low fuel, Fletcher requested permission to withdraw the carriers, which Gormley granted early the next morning. An hour after midnight, Admiral Mikawa led 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and a destroyer into what would soon be named Iron Bottom Sound between Savo, Florida, and Guadalcanal Islands. Mikawa engaged and quickly defeated Crutchley's dispersed screening force, sinking 1 Australian and 3 American heavy cruisers and damaging a 5th. As he led his cruiser column on the sweep north, for reasons unexplained, Mikawa's flagship, Chikai, turned hard to starboard. The rest of the column continued north, however, leaving Chikai out of formation and forced to catch up. Having planned to split up to attack Turner's transports and cargo ships, Mikawa and his staff calculated that the time needed to reform the force, reload their torpedo tubes, would expose them to daylight air attack. With his gun magazine still 60% full, Mikawa's force exited the Sound and departed the way it came, passing up the opportunity to deal the Allies a truly strategic reverse. The Battle of Savo Island is considered the Navy's worst open sea defeat. It cost the lives of 1,077 U.S. and Australian officers, enlisted sailors, and 700 wounded. When informed of the result on 12 August, King at first thought the report was garbled. He later called Savo Island the blackest day of the war. There's no record of his notification of Roosevelt. He embargoed information about the battle and was not reported in the press until October. Few outside his staff knew about it initially, including the Army. He commissioned an inquest by retired Admiral Arthur J. Hepburn in December. Hepburn reported in March 1943 that the primary cause of this defeat must be ascribed generally to the complete surprise achieved by the enemy. He cited a lack of readiness among the Allied ships, communications failures, over-reliance on radar, poor air reconnaissance, and the premature withdrawal of carrier support. For the most part, Hepburn declined to ascribe individual responsibility. Nimitz and King concurred. However, aspersion cast on Fletcher's decision-making contributed to King's determination to remove him from carrier command in late 1942. Now, had Mikawa pressed his opportunity, the consequences could have been much worse. The loss of Turner's transports and cargo ships would have stranded the Marines without prospect of evacuation or reinforcement, with few ships left capable of supplying them. Without Guadalcanal-based air support, it would not be hard to imagine the Japanese interdicting that supply line and forcing their surrender. Roosevelt could have faced the political consequences of the loss of a fourth U.S. Pacific garrison after Guam, Wake, and Bataan Corregidor to the Japanese since December 1941 in the upcoming 1942 November congressional elections. King could have been replaced as Cominch, possibly by Nimitz. Without King's assertive aggressiveness, U.S. strategy in the Pacific might have become more conservative and focused on MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Command. Yet, the strategic impact would probably have been limited. Transport, cargo ship, and personnel losses would be replaced in a matter of months. The Pacific Fleet retained its carrier groups and the ability to counter Japanese offensive naval operations. The buildup of Navy strength during the 1930s, which culminated in the Two-Ocean Navy Act of 1940, backstopped all U.S. naval wartime strategic decision-making. The new Big Blue Navy provided the means for overwhelming Japan beginning in 1944. While the timing and sequence may have differed, the ultimate outcome of the war would not have been in doubt. So, how should we think about Ernest King's risk-taking? George Dyer, Turner's biographer, observed that had the logistical challenges been fully understood beforehand, the operation would never have been approved. In the final analysis, King's gamble succeeded, at substantial cost, and by the thinnest of margins. The campaign fulfilled the objectives he set for it. Together with the Battle of Midway, victory at Guadalcanal turned the tide against Japan and laid the foundation for its eventual defeat. I'd like to pose a parting question. Does risk analysis sharpen military decision-making, or does it inhibit risk-taking? Given the current U.S. strategic command and control architecture, would it be possible for any wartime military leader to take a gamble comparable to King's? There are no longer any analogs to the wartime chief of staff. Strategic decision-making now resides with the President and Secretary of Defense. Theater strategy is the province of the commanders of the regional joint combatant commands. There are doctrinal procedures for appraising and evaluating risk. U.S. military and political leaders are highly sensitized to its consequences. Risk-taking is an indispensable aspect of warfare. Can it still be done? Thank you.
Well, thank you all for your papers. Famous generals like Napoleon and Patton often spoke of the experiences they had gained from reading histories about campaigns of other generals. As a serving officer interested in history, I've tried to apply history where I could. During the 1980s, the Center for Naval Analysis conducted several studies of carrier.
Excuse me, could you stand up so we can see you?
Sorry, I'll move over here. And it's really crazy to talk about the 1980s maritime strategy with Captain Schwartz in the room.
Everybody's doing fine.
During the 1980s, the Center for Naval Analysis conducted several studies on carrier striker operations around Europe, with an emphasis on protecting the carrier from air and subsurface threats. My last job was Operations Officer at Destroyer Squadron 26, where my job was to protect the carrier around Europe. So I found those 30-something-year-old studies useful for talking with my lieutenants on how we would go about protecting the carrier today. With today's strategic competition, we once again look at the Pacific and how we would fight the next war. Understanding of the strategic thoughts, successes, and failures of those who planned and fought the last Pacific War is crucial to ensure that they aren't lessons noted, but are lessons learned. As Dr. Francis alluded to, this project started with Rear Admiral Tom Williams, the CNO's Director of Plans, Policy, and Integration, or OPNAV-N5 for short. His first project lead was Commander Chauvin, who briefed yesterday on the Cold War in Antarctica. I replaced him in October 2020 when he left OPNAV to take a position. I'd been in the building for 2 months at that point. Admiral Williams thought I was well suited to take on this project in my capacity as both a historian and as a military planner. Before I'd ever joined the Navy, I'd earned my master's degree in history, and before I came to my current role at OPNAV-N5, I was operations officer for Destroyer Squadron 26, and I previously served as a planner on an operational staff in Korea. By the time I stepped into the project, I felt as if I was in a position where I could really contribute and be an effective member of the team. Once NHHC and Admiral Williams agreed on the top 10 lessons that we were going to use for the book, the historians at NHHC quickly proposed chapter titles and drafts for us and got drafts to us shortly thereafter. The titles came out in December, and by January, I sent in back drafts edits. So they were amazing at their process. Although I was lead action officer, my boss, Captain Jeremy Wheat, and our GS-15, Miss Christine Ozalski, spent considerable time editing with me to ensure we captured everything we could from an operational perspective. One of our biggest hurdles that led to lots of discussions was the historians knew the history, but they didn't understand the modern planning process. Our OpNav edits of the book helped incorporate some of our planning experiences into the chapters where required, and we also added discussion questions for each chapter of the book so that we could help guide wardroom and planning cell discussions on what were some things to think about as we went through. I think the collaboration between NHHC and OpNav created a product that was relevant both to today's planning cells and for history, especially after some of the AO level feedback I've gotten from US Fleet Forces and from Marine Forces Europe, who are incorporating this in their own planning and training cells. For the questions, Dr. Francis, I think one thing that NHHC could do to increase historian effectiveness in projects like this would be to send some of their historians to Newport for the Maritime Operational Planning course or to the Maritime Staff Operations course. These courses could improve the historians' understanding of modern doctrine and increase their effectiveness for writing for the current planners. Do you think that something like that would be useful for historians, especially those tasked with OpNav support? Dr. Francis and Dr. Lukey, one of the things that stood out to me in chapter 9 of the book was that Admiral Gormley didn't have access to fuel burn tables for his staff to plan when the ships would need refueling. When I was at Desron, the thing that Commodore killed me most on was when are the ships getting fuel and how are they doing it? It still boggles my mind that they went into World War II without that sort of level of knowledge for when they would need to do that. In your paper today, you discuss several industry studies conducted during the war, but implementation of their recommendations mostly waited until after the war. Can you discuss how the Navy improved their logistics planning through the course of the war while waiting for larger changes after? Dr. Woodford, you ended your paper with a question on decision and risk today. Based on your time at N7, how would you answer that today? Dr. Lukey, the Guadalcanal campaign was really a race to culmination between the Japanese and US forces. Can you discuss how both sides' long supply lines impacted their offensive abilities? And finally, Dr. Woodford, you mentioned your biggest surprise was the lack of primary source documents on the Navy strategic planning for the war, and that you had to rely on Army sources to get the Navy strategy. Looking to the future and the terabytes of data that our planners create, do you have any recommendations of the best way to preserve that data for future historians critiquing us today?
All right, thank you. I think we'll just we'll go down the line and try to briefly answer those questions. So it's very convenient that you asked the question about will historians benefit from taking the operations planning course or the staff planning course when my boss is sitting next to me. I got another boss in the back of the room. So yes, why yes, I do. If we could somehow find the funding, that would be awesome and improve the capability of historians to help the operating Navy and show our value. So yes, completely agree that, you know, I developed some of that indirectly by my reserve career and reserve deployments, but other historians didn't have that opportunity to go on vacation for Uncle Sam. So yes, I do agree with that point. On the question of bases, which you saw in Sean's presentation, one of the interesting things when we were looking at the spring of 1942 is that both the US and the Japanese are in a race to control the approaches to Australia. So, and they're both the Japanese and the United States, it's complete shoestring operations with decisions being made in Washington or Tokyo, being impacted by both other parts of the war. Like the Japanese, of course, they're still fighting in the Dutch East Indies, right? They still have to support operations in Burma. They're trying to clean up the Dutch and these annoying Americans hanging out in the Philippines. And then sort of almost as an aside, they divert some forces toward to take Leh and Rabaul, and then into Bougainville and the Northern Solomons. But these things keep getting diverted by the demands of shipping. The same thing happens in the United States, right? Where, again, it's shipping, where there's a huge argument between the Navy and the Army over garrisoning the lily pad bases in the South Pacific. And at one point, there's an agreement to delay Lend-Lease shipments to free up by 30 days in order to free up shipping, so you can send, Seabees into the South Pacific. There's a fuel depot at Bora Bora that's required for the smaller ships that are going to have to stop on the way because they don't have the legs to make it all the way to Noumea. They even had to get millions of gallons of aviation gas to Noumea so it could act as a depot for the bases in the New Hebrides. And that's where the Seabees are critical, because the Seabee battalions that are being formed almost, completely ad hoc manner, they're shoved into ships and then sent to the South Pacific and said, all right, we're going to build a base here. No, actually go over there and build it. And so their Seabees end up in the New Hebrides at Efate and Espirito Santos, where they end up building a workable airbase in 20 days. And that is sort of that culmination point where, because Noumea, you got to remember, is 800 miles away from Guadalcanal. It's too far away for effective land-based air operations. So they build these bases in the New Hebrides by June, and even some aren't operational till early July. And so King's decision there, he understands that the sea lines of communication to Australia, they go through Noumea. I mean, that's where the pivot point is. The ships either go south to Australia, or they're going to pivot north toward the Japanese. And so I actually think that because that threat to the sea line of communication was so severe, at least he perceived it as being severe, that encouraged him to take that risk decision that he has to go ahead with Watchtower because he's so worried about the Japanese being able to conduct air attacks against the shipping heading to Australia, and that if they'd established a good enough air umbrella there, that would force shipping to go south around New Zealand and make a long voyage even longer. Still doable, but from his perspective, it would annoyingly delay it and prevent, as you also pointed out, the ability to have a base from which to then launch attacks against Japan and enable Watchtower in the first place. So anyway, I just thought it's a great demonstration of where you have two culminating points, and the U.S. ends up winning because of our capability to put those bases in operations quicker. I'll end my long ramble by saying the Japanese occupied Guadalcanal and Tulagi for almost 3 months. They only started to build the airbase on Guadalcanal 30 days before we landed, and they didn't finish it. Once we landed, it was put into operation 10 days later. So I think that's a significant element of why we win that race to get the logistics, at least a bare bones framework established and allow Watchtower to go forward.
All right, so interesting to mention the burn tables for fuel. There's one source I read that was talking about World War I. After the end of World War I, in 1919 in Maine Navy, someone was given the job of writing to every captain and asking him, how much fuel do you estimate you use a day? How much food do you need? We want to have this on hand in case we need to know about it. And that was World War I. So they're thinking about it. But just still amazing that after World War I is only when they decide they need to know how much do we need to fuel the ships. So I took the question basically to be, given the grimness of what I said, how did the Navy do anything in World War II? And I think the answer there, right, is that I'm taking a very OpNav centric perspective on how things are going. And if you look at the broad U.S. war effort, there are all kinds of civilian coordinating committees and boards, wartime shipping administration, et cetera, that basically come in because this is a problem across all of the services. And then they end up at various points kind of creating more problems. But to my mind, that's what's going on, is that there's a lot of administrative churn back in CONUS, and everyone's trying to figure things out and how to rationalize. And then what ends up happening is that the theater commanders really make do. And they get most of the material that they need. And so a good example of this are these advanced base units. As the Navy says, we're going to have advanced base units. We're just going to send them in, everything you need, shake and bake base. And we're going to key them to small and large, like ships or aircraft. They go, but that breaks down because basically every time it gets chopped over, somebody poaches something from it. Like it'll go from the Western Sea frontier and then it'll go out and somebody goes, hey, I really need like all the concrete mixers and all the concrete. And so then that gets taken out. And then the next person says, I need a few specialists to do that. And so then when it gets to where it's supposed to go, it has none of the tools that it needs to really do what it's supposed to do. And so over the course of the war, one of the Navy learns is that it creates basically a big catalog of standard things that you can order. And then the theater commander goes down and checks off all the stuff that they want and says, hey, send this to me. I need this. This is a requisition. So there is learning that's going on. But I think you look at a lot, well, not even, I'm going to draw upon the book Yano and Heinrich's Implacable Foes. Duncan Valentine says this too, is that there is an absolute crisis in shipping and the ability to move stuff around in 45. And part of the reason for that is the theater commanders. The annoying American in the Philippines, Dugout Doug, right, is that SWAPO is a black hole for shipping and just screws up every planning table that everyone has, because once it enters MacArthur's clutches, he doesn't let it go again until he's damn well sure he's done with it. And so, on one hand, that's how things get done. It also kind of points to, I guess, what was or wasn't done at higher levels, right? Is that you do have MacArthur running wild through 1945, basically uncontrolled by anyone. And there's a commander-in-chief of all of the armed forces who could have stepped in to kind of handle those problems if he had desired. So I think that, go over to you for the.
Yeah, no, I think we're about done. I'll quickly move through. Does risk analysis sharpen military decision-making? Yes, when it's done and paid attention to. Does it inhibit risk-taking? Yes, it does. But I think one of the things that pop out from the question I looked at are that assessing risk is very personality dependent. Different people assess risks in different ways, and leaders at different levels will respond to different levels, kinds of risks. The other thing too is even in the 21st century with all our electronic communications capabilities, instantaneous, it is still difficult to communicate and discuss these sorts of things and get on the same page. So, yes, for a historian answer, you got a historian answer.
I guess as the chair.
Yeah.
The comment, I can't remember how it's done anymore. Chris.
Sean, you discussed the implications of McCullough not attacking the transports, and then you also talked about the likelihood that even if he had, it wouldn't have really mattered because the productive capacity in the United States would have made up for those potential losses. But I pose this question because that is a question often asked by historians. But as we know, the enemy gets a vote. Mm-hmm. More importantly, the question is, how does the enemy cast that ballot? And that is, Japanese doctrine doesn't call for them to attack transports. It's the same thing as the issue of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Well, they didn't strike if they had struck the oil tanks and the dry docks, it would have crippled the ability of the U.S. fleet to recover from the attack. Well, that wasn't their goal. Their goal was to sink ships. And the operational mindset of the Japanese basically means, I mean, that's a hypothetical, in my opinion, and I would like to know if you agree, that it's a hypothetical discussion that really doesn't fit the situation, because that's not what the Japanese would ever intend to do.
I think that's a fair observation. My response would be, even if it didn't fit their doctrine, the opportunity was there. I think there was an awareness. I think after the battle, Yamamoto criticized Mikawa for not going for the transports, which I believe were his objective. His scheme of maneuver for that attack that night was to engage the transport. The Japanese cruisers had launched their floatplanes. They reconned the anchorage, and they knew where the general layout of the forces were. Mikawa's scheme of maneuver was to attack the Curtis is shaking his head now. So I think that was his intent. Why he didn't do it, this is a part of the problem where, we didn't fully debrief the Japanese commanders. There were interviews. That's why we know what we know. But I don't think, we still don't know exactly why Chikai slew out of line. Was Mikawa trying to lead the column to one of the anchorages? Was he just trying to clear the line of fire because there were two light cruisers on the other side of the U.S. ships? I don't know. We observed the opportunity. Would they have actually done it? It's a fair question to ask. We're operating in the realm of counterfactuals. So,
Amanda, you have a question?
It's actually kind of two parts. One, to answer the question that he asked, which is, he asked the historian about preserving terabytes of data. That's the archivist's job, in particular, the digital archivist, me. So when you're talking about OpNav in particular, though, we, over many years now, have run into the issues with, because the OpNav staff at every info level and beyond is on a cyclical pattern, we'll talk to somebody in an OpNav office, try to set something up with regards to data transfer, and then they immediately transfer out of the office. We have to rebuild that relationship every 2 to 3 years. In the meantime, we're dealing with, NNCI and all these other Navy restrictions that really impede, but that does not mean that we're not trying, which was going back. So, we could talk after if you want about getting to transferring records tomorrow, but going to, how OpNav and the historians work together. Kelly Turner's papers, this is all 80 years ago. But in the meantime, I sit around all day working with terabytes of data from OEF, OIF, whether it's stuff that they pulled off the servers over there from NAVCENT and Fifth Fleet, or the oral histories, which I say are just, intelligence waiting to be used. Are those useful today? Since you guys are talking about a war that happened 80 years ago, but these modern day wars, 20 years in the making, well, you're not even looking at the fact we just pulled out, but the day of the invasion, is that material useful today, or is it only going to be useful 60 years from now?
On the panel?
So the short answer to that is, of course, it will be useful. The question, which is far too big to talk about right now, is access, security review, and release. So it's usable.
Right, but talking about if you're just saying between a conversation between OpNav and our offices, I think that's a little bit easier to handle, because if you're talking about the way that you guys formulated the Turner pamphlet, you're working with people in the Pentagon who it might be a little easier to allow access to this stuff, because obviously a lot of this stuff is still, but so that's, but if you're talking about just a relationship between OpNav and the command as far as the modern day wars, would that be useful to an OPNAV person looking at intelligence from 20 years ago? And not just intelligence in the word intelligence, like Admiral Cox intelligence, but in that anything that the Navy did 20 years ago is considered intelligence.
Yes, and again, short answer is yes. And we've even had, I think there are people here at the conference who have done studies on much more recent events, Gulf War I, and there have been papers on Iraq and Afghanistan in the past. So I do think, if I'm understanding what you're saying, yes, they are. That is useful. It just is a harder nut to crack to get it releasable and usable for the historians. And I'm not sure, from the OPNAV perspective, I'm sure they would want to know, some of those decisions in OAF 1, for example, there were 4 carriers operating in support of that campaign in April of 2003. So those are useful, probably almost certainly useful lessons there. It's just we have to get over that extra hurdle of the security.
And I guess Michael, should I be putting the time into it that I put into it every day, or should I be focusing on something else? So, but if it's useful, that's kind of.
I think Sean wanted to.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a quick comment. I think your question is great. I do not envy the lot of archivists these days trying to document things going on in the digital era. My experience as a historian, I used to work at SOCOM before I came to NHHC, which was part of the Joint History Program. And one of the things we put an emphasis on was collecting from the field, because we could not rely on records management processes to actually get documents to us. And there's one thing I took away from that is that saving records at the unit level, or ship level, or command level is a function of command leadership. If the commander thinks it's important, it'll get done. They will find a way to get the records to the archives. All too often, commanders do not make an emphasis on it, which means it's going to be some staff members' collateral responsibility, and they're going to have a billion other things to do before they think about, I should send these records to the historian. So I would evangelize and proselytize to commanders, if you want your history written, you have to make sure your records get saved and transferred to NHHC, whoever saves your
We had
records.
another question over here.
You wanted to follow up on that?
Yeah, I just have just a quick follow-up. Right, is that the records here with Kelly Turner were important, because the question that was asked is, how does a planning staff learn how to orient themselves towards great power competition? And the point to make there is that the last time that happened in the history of the U.S. Navy was World War II. And so the sources that are useful for the project are dictated by the question that's asked. And so I think as long as we're focused on great power competition, materials further in the past are going to be used more often than the mechanics of dropping JDAMs on somebody at Tora Bora.
All right, I
Just a quick footnote follow up on a question about Gunichi Makawa's decision-making at Sego Island, and that is that I think there are a couple of reasons why he doesn't do this. It was his intention, that was his initial objective, as you suggested, to get to the transports and destroy the ability of the Allies to sustain their foothold on Guadalcanal. But 2 things held him back. One is the fact that though he had 60% of his gunfire ammunition remaining, he had fired off virtually all of his torpedoes. And the Japanese considered torpedoes to be their particular anti-ship weapon. And he thought, well, without torpedoes, how much damage can I do? Secondly, and I think this is critical because it affects the the subsequent argument between Turner and Fletcher about responsibility, is that he had been at the Battle of Midway and had seen what the American dive bombers did there and did not want to be caught in daylight, subject to American dive bomber attack. And during that time, although Fletcher had received permission from Gormley to withdraw the evening before, he did not do so until the day after. So that during the battle, in the middle of the night, the American carrier, Fletcher, was in covering position south of the island, but he didn't have night-capable fighters and couldn't do much about it at the time. So when Turner blamed Fletcher, the premature, and even Hepburn, the premature withdrawal was not premature, as far as Sable Island is concerned. And so that, I think, was Turner looking for an explanation to justify and excuse himself. He was SOFA at the time and got away with everything, frankly, because he was perceived as being more victim than culpable. But I think that's all pertinent to the personnel issue. I just wanted to throw that in.
More questions?
I enjoyed the book immensely, enjoyed the read. It was really good, and I thought you guys did some great research. But one of the omissions I found in it was the lack of discussion about commercial shipping and merchant shipping. And one of the things that you look at, if you're going from San Francisco to Australia, it's 7,000 miles, and Pearl Harbor, it's 9,000 miles. And Turner could draw upon commercial shipping that was available, ships from Matson, ships from American Presence Lines, from the Army Transport Service. And one of the things the Japanese do with their I-boat attack along the west coast and their auxiliary cruisers is force Americans to have to convoy across that distance. Slows it up, diverts resources, and if it's going to be used for an in-flight planning document, you substitute Australia for Taiwan, you're building on a merchant marine where lessons were drawn from the First World War. I can't take exception with an issue you said about the easy logistics or the simplified logistics from World War I. I think World War I logistics was really complicated, and I think it set the tone for World War II. We passed a series of merchant marine acts during the interwar years that gives you a merchant marine second in the world, and it allows the U.S. to build upon. The Bobcat operation used 3 maritime commission ships to, for example, do it. So I thought that was one. I thought that was the one issue with it that I saw was that really not a discussion about that. And I think that's an important thing, especially for future planning, if that's what you're going to use this for.
All right, I think we're over our time, but I'm sure the panel will be happy to stay here and.
Good fun.
Thank you.
Thank you all.